All right, everyone, get ready, because today we're diving into some really heavy stuff.
Yeah, definitely not lighthearted today.
We're tackling the biblical justifications for slavery.
Oh, cool.
We're going to be cracking open a book from 1852.
Oh, wow.
It's called Origin, Character, and Fortunes of the Negro Race.
That's going to be interesting.
Before we even get started,
Yeah.
I want to be super clear.
Sure.
We are here to understand the arguments that are presented in this book.
Right.
We are not here to endorse them.
Absolutely not.
It's more like we're peeking into a time capsule
Exactly.
and seeing what kind of disturbing beliefs were held back then.
Yeah. It's going to be a journey.
So get ready.
Yeah.
It's going to get pretty wild.
For sure.
We're talking Noah's curse,
Oh, yeah.
biblical interpretations of slavery
Mm-hmm.
in both the Old and New Testaments,
Yep.
and even claims about the nature of black people
Okay.
that are just downright offensive
Yeah.
for
Tough
today's
word.
standards.
100%.
So, yeah.
It's going to be a lot. It's a lot.
But I think it'll be really interesting.
Yeah.
One of the things you'll see over and over again in this book
Okay.
is how much they rely on the story of Noah's curse on his son Ham.
Right. From Genesis.
Yeah, Genesis 9.25, 2e7.
Okay. So Noah curses Canaan,
Yeah.
Ham's son,
Yeah.
to be a servant of servants to his brothers.
Mhm.
But how does a story about one family
Right.
turn into this justification for enslaving an entire race of people?
Well, that's where the interpretation gets really interesting.
Okay.
And honestly, really disturbing.
Okay.
They're claiming that black people are descended from Ham.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, they inherit this curse of servitude.
Okay.
It goes even further to say that this curse is proof that God intended this racial hierarchy,
Wow.
that it's part of the natural order of the world.
So they're basically saying that God wanted black people to be enslaved.
That's essentially what they're arguing.
I mean, even back then in 1852,
Yeah.
that's got to be a tough pill to swallow. You have to remember the context.
Okay.
This was a time when there was intense debate about slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Abolitionist movements were gaining momentum,
Yeah.
and the pro-slavery side was desperate for justifications.
Right.
They needed something,
Yeah.
and using biblical authority was a very powerful way to silence dissent.
So it's almost like they're weaponizing religion
Exact.
to maintain power and control.
That's a really good way to put it.
It's a tactic that we see,
Yeah,
sadly, not just in this time period.
not at all, unfortunately.
And this idea of a divinely ordained curse,
Yeah.
it just played right into
Yeah,
existing prejudices and
absolutely.
anxieties about race.
For sure.
It kind of gave slaveholders
Yeah,
this sense of moral righteousness.
right, exactly.
They could tell themselves that they weren't just exploiting people,
Yeah.
but that they were actually fulfilling God's will.
It's a pretty convenient interpretation, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, very convenient.
It lets them off the hook for the consequences of their actions.
Right, but let's move beyond Noah's curse for a second.
Okay.
The book also goes into other biblical interpretations of slavery,
Oh, yeah, they dig deep.
pulling from both the Old and New Testaments.
Mm-hmm. They analyze passages that seem to endorse slavery,
Okay.
like Leviticus 25.44446, for example,
Right.
which talks about taking slaves from neighboring nations.
Interesting.
And they get really into the details
Okay.
of the specific Hebrew words for different types of servitude,
Okay.
trying to create this clear distinction between temporary indentured servitude
Mm-hmm.
and permanent inherited slavery.
So they're trying to create this whole legal framework based
Exactly.
on these ancient texts.
It's like they're obsessed with making slavery
Yeah.
not just acceptable,
Right.
but like meticulously planned,
Wow.
ordained by God.
Okay, but hold on a second.
Yeah.
What about the New Testament?
That's a great question.
Didn't Jesus preach love and compassion? How do they reconcile slavery with those teachings?
That was a big question at the time
Yeah.
that abolitionists were raising.
Right.
But the book argues that the New Testament doesn't actually condemn slavery.
Right.
They point to passages like Paul's letter to Philemon,
Okay.
where he urges the runaway slave Onesimus to return to his master.
So they're basically saying slavery's okay as long as you're nice to your slaves.
It's a pretty weak argument, even for the time.
Yeah, that's pretty weak.
They can't ignore the message of Christian love completely.
Mm.
So they try to reframe slavery as a system that can be practiced ethically,
Mm-hmm.
with masters treating their slaves kindly.
But that doesn't address like the inherent power imbalance
Exactly.
and the denial of basic human freedoms.
You're exactly right.
It's like saying it's okay to lock someone in a cage as long as you feed them regularly.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
That's where you see the limitations of their logic
Yeah.
and the mental gymnastics they have to do to justify a system that's inherently inhumane.
So we've seen how they use Noah's curse
Yeah.
and these cherry-picked biblical passages to defend slavery.
Right.
But it gets even more unsettling.
Oh, yeah.
The book goes beyond those biblical arguments
Okay.
and dives into the supposed nature of black people.
Here we go.
And let me warn you, it's pretty rough.
Yeah, this is where we see what we now call scientific racism coming into play.
Okay.
The author uses pseudo-science to argue that black people are inherently inferior, that they're less intelligent, less emotional, and even physically closer to animals.
Oh my gosh.
They use everything from skull measurements to skin color.
Seriously.
To try to prove their point.
It's shocking to read this kind of blatant racism.
It is.
Even for a book published over 150 years ago.
Yeah, it's really disturbing.
But I think it's important to understand how these ideas were used to dehumanize black people.
Absolutely.
And justify their enslavement.
It's a perfect example of how supposedly objective scientific language can be twisted to serve a prejudiced agenda.
It's like they're not just saying that black people are different.
Right.
They're saying that they're less than white people.
Yeah.
And therefore, they deserve to be subjugated.
It's a chilling example of how ideology can be used to rationalize cruelty.
It's like they're building this whole worldview where slavery seems not only acceptable, but necessary.
Exactly. They're creating a narrative where black people are inherently inferior, unfit for freedom, and better off under the control of white masters.
This is heavy stuff.
It is.
But I think it's important that we confront these uncomfortable truths.
I agree.
So we've seen how they use Noah's curse, biblical interpretations, and now pseudoscience to build their case for slavery.
It's a lot.
But surely there were opposing voices even back then.
Oh, absolutely.
What about abolitionist arguments?
They definitely existed.
They couldn't have just ignored this growing movement against slavery.
They didn't ignore it, but they definitely tried to discredit it.
How so?
Well, we'll dive into that when we come back for part 2
Sounds good.
of this deep dive.
All right, everybody stick with us.
Yeah.
We're going to take a closer look at how this book grapples with the abolitionist movement when we return.
It's going to get even more interesting.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into this 1852 book, Arguing for Slavery.
Yeah, we're picking up right where we left off.
Remember how the author twisted the Bible?
Yeah.
And used so-called science to try and make black people seem inferior?
It's pretty disturbing stuff.
It really is.
You'd think they'd run out of ways to defend slavery.
You'd think so.
But no, they keep going.
Sadly.
It's like they're building this case brick by disturbing brick.
That's a good way to put it.
But you mentioned they also addressed abolitionist arguments?
Right.
It's not like they were just operating in a vacuum.
Not at all.
There were people fighting against slavery even back then.
Absolutely.
So how did they handle those voices?
They couldn't just ignore the abolitionist movement. It was gaining too much traction. But they tried to paint abolitionists as dangerous, radical, and emotional.
So kind of a classic us versus them tactic.
Exactly. Divide and conquer.
But what were some of the specific arguments?
Yeah, good question.
That abolitionists were making? And how did this book try to counter them?
Well, one of the main points abolitionists raised was the economic argument. They argued that slavery was bad for the economy.
Interesting.
That a system based on free labor would be way more efficient.
Okay, I could see that.
They pointed to the North, which was mostly based on free labor and how much more successful it was compared to the South, which relied on enslaved labor.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's hard to innovate when your economy is based on forced labor.
Absolutely.
So how did the book respond to that?
The author basically argued that the South's economy would completely collapse without slavery. They said that enslaved people were needed to produce cotton and other crops, and that freeing them would lead to poverty and chaos.
So it's all about fear-mongering.
Pretty much.
Trying to scare people into keeping things the way they are.
Exactly.
But it wasn't really about the economy, was it?
No, not really.
It's about power.
That's right.
And control. And the wealth that came with it.
Exactly. The economic arguments were just a cover for white supremacy and the belief that black people were inferior and incapable of participating in a free society.
Okay, so they tried to shut down that economic argument.
Yeah.
What other abolitionist points did they target?
Well, abolitionists also argued that slavery was just morally wrong, plain and simple.
Makes sense.
They talked about basic human rights, the dignity of every person. They said that nobody should be treated as property.
Yeah, that's a powerful argument.
You would think that would be hard to argue against.
I would.
But I bet this book found a way.
I bet they did.
They said that slavery, as it was practiced in the South, wasn't actually that bad.
Wait, are you serious?
Yeah, they painted this romanticized picture of benevolent masters who were kind to their slaves. Yeah, they basically tried to rewrite history.
Wow.
To make it seem like slavery was some kind of happy arrangement.
It's like a totally whitewashed version of events.
Totally. Yeah. It ignores the brutal reality of slavery completely.
Right.
Families being torn apart, physical and sexual abuse.
Yeah.
It's classic propaganda.
Wow.
It's an attempt to justify the unjustifiable.
It's mind-boggling how they could twist things like that.
It is.
But what about the abolitionists?
Yeah.
They must have had some pretty strong counterpoints.
It did.
To the claims that enslaved people were content and well-treated.
They shared firsthand accounts from people who had escaped slavery.
Oh, wow.
These narratives really exposed the truth.
Okay.
About the violence and degradation of slavery.
Right.
They also pointed out that enslaved people were resisting.
Yes.
Through sabotage, escape, and even rebellion.
That's powerful stuff.
It is. Those firsthand accounts are hard to argue with.
Yeah.
But the book tries to dismiss them.
Of course they do.
They say these accounts were exaggerated or made up.
Wow.
They claimed enslaved people couldn't understand their own situation.
Like, they're not only defending slavery, they're also trying to silence the voices of those who are most affected by it.
Exactly.
It's like a double injustice.
It is.
So they're trying to control the narrative.
That's right.
To maintain the power structure. It's a reminder that power isn't just about physical force.
Right.
It's about controlling information.
Yes.
And shaping how people see reality.
Very well said.
So we've seen how they countered the economic arguments.
Yeah.
The moral arguments, and even the testimonies of enslaved people. What else did the abolitionists bring up that the book tried to address?
They talked about Black people's ability to govern themselves.
Okay.
Abolitionists argued Black people were just as capable as white people of living in freedom and governing themselves.
That's a key point.
It is.
If you're going to argue that slavery is necessary because Black people can't handle freedom, you need to back that up with more than just prejudice.
Absolutely.
So did they.
The book tries to, but their arguments are really weak.
Okay.
They use examples of instability in some African nations, but they ignore the impact of colonialism and internal conflicts.
Of course.
They also point to freed Black people in the North who struggled.
Okay.
And they blame that on laziness or incompetence.
Wow.
Instead of recognizing the systemic racism they face.
It's the same blame the victim mentality.
Exactly.
They just refuse to acknowledge how white supremacy creates inequality.
Absolutely.
And this all leads to their solution.
Oh, right, their solution.
To the so-called problem of Black people in America.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Colonization.
They think the best thing to do is send freed Black people to Africa.
Wait, are you serious?
I am.
They really thought that was a viable solution.
Yeah, colonization was pretty popular in the 19th century.
It sounds absurd now.
It does.
But the American Colonization Society had some powerful supporters.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even well-intentioned ideas can be based on really problematic assumptions.
Like the assumption that America is fundamentally a white nation.
Exactly.
And that Black people will always be outsiders.
It's not about equality or justice. It's about removing Black people from white society.
But while still maintaining white supremacy.
Exactly.
It's a reminder of how deeply ingrained these ideas were.
It is.
And how much work we still have to do.
Yeah.
So we've seen how this book tries to discredit abolitionist arguments.
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
From economics to morals to the testimonies of enslaved people.
It's been a long list.
And their solution is colonization.
Right.
Which is just another form of control.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating to see how the pro-slavery movement thought.
It is.
Even as they faced more and more opposition, it shows their desperation to maintain power.
Yeah, they were clinging to it.
It's a reminder that ideology can be incredibly powerful.
It is.
It can blind people to the humanity of others.
Absolutely.
And justify terrible cruelty.
But it's also a testament to the strength of those who fought against slavery.
That's true.
Who refused to be silenced.
Yeah.
And who helped to bring about its end.
Speaking of those who fought against slavery, the book also talks about how they use the Bible to support their views.
Okay, so we're back to the Bible.
We are.
How do they use Scripture to defend slavery?
It's a lot of mental gymnastics.
A bit.
And cherry-picking verses.
All right, let's hear it.
Get ready for some creative interpretations.
Okay, so we're back for the last part of our deep dive into this pro-slavery book from 1852. It's been quite a journey.
Yeah, we've seen some really twisted logic.
We have.
And last time we left off with the book tackling abolitionist arguments.
Right.
Now we're going to see how they try to use the Bible to defend slavery.
And you hit the nail on the head when you said try.
Okay.
Because it's a real masterclass in twisting Scripture to fit an agenda.
So walk me through it.
Okay.
How did they use the Bible? Which so many people consider a text about love and compassion to justify something as awful as slavery.
They focused on very specific passages, mostly from the Old Testament that mention slavery. They really honed in on those laws from ancient Israel. You know, the ones that regulated slavery.
Yeah.
And argued that those laws proved God was okay with it.
But isn't that a super narrow interpretation?
It is.
I mean, the Bible's a complex book.
Super complex.
With tons of different viewpoints.
Exactly.
You can't just pull out a few verses and ignore everything else.
That's their biggest problem. They ignore all those passages about justice and mercy and the inherent dignity of all people. And they don't consider that the Bible was written over centuries in all sorts of different cultures and contexts.
So they're basically taking it super literally.
Pretty much.
Ignoring all the nuance.
All the nuance, yeah.
Like it's some kind of legal document.
Right, not a sacred text.
Yeah, that's disturbing.
What's even worse is that they then use this messed up interpretation to say that slavery isn't just okay, but that it's God's plan.
Wow, that's a big claim.
It is.
How do you reconcile the idea of a loving God with a system like slavery?
It's a tough question.
Yeah.
That's challenged people for centuries, but this book just ignores it.
They just brush it aside.
Yeah. They say that slavery as practiced in the South was actually good. That masters were like caring fathers to their slaves.
It's like they're living in a completely different world. They ignore all the brutality. The family's torn apart.
It's crazy.
The total whitewashing of history.
Absolutely.
They're creating a story that fits their goals.
Exactly.
Even if it means ignoring the suffering of millions.
It's incredible.
It's interesting how they use the Bible.
Yeah.
But they also use this so-called science.
Right.
Which is really just prejudice.
It's just more justification.
It seems like they'll use anything to defend slavery.
They're grasping at straws, trying to build their case using religion, bad science, bigotry.
And that's what makes this book so dangerous.
Very dangerous.
It presents these harmful ideas as if they're good.
Right.
And even as if God wants them.
Yeah.
It reminds us to be super critical of information we see.
Yeah, especially with sensitive topics.
Like race.
And social justice.
We have to ask questions.
Definitely.
And challenge what we think we know.
And look at things from different sides.
This deep dive has really been something.
It has.
We've seen some twisted logic.
A lot of...
Used to try to defend slavery.
Back in the 19th century.
We've seen how they misuse the Bible, distort science,
and dehumanize Black people.
All to protect their own interests.
It's been heavy stuff.
It has.
But I think it's really important to understand this history.
I agree.
So we can learn from it.
And not repeat it.
Exactly.
I think it's amazing how far we've come since this book was published.
It is pretty amazing.
Slavery isn't legal anymore.
Right.
And we're getting better at recognizing everyone's rights and dignity.
It's true.
But the fight for equality isn't over.
Not at all.
We still see racism and discrimination.
All the time.
And the fight for social justice is ongoing. So as we finish up, I hope you come away with a sense of caution.
Okay.
And hope
I like that.
Be cautious about how ideology can be used to justify bad things.
Powerful stuff.
But also have hope.
Yeah.
That we can overcome prejudice and create a society that's fair and just.
That's the goal.
That's a great note to end on. This has been our deep dive into origin, character, and fortunes of the Negro race. Keep exploring this history.
Yes.
Question what you think you know, and keep fighting for a world that's more just and caring.
Couldn't have said it better myself.